Well, we have some time for questions if anyone's got a question for any of the speakers. Yes.
I was in Vietnam at the time, and so I had these little newspapers that came back, it was probably shortly after the event, and it was showing all the railroad tracks, particularly that they just been undercut, just falling in. Was there any other train other than the one that you talked about, John, that was involved in this? Because there's a car, I know that a railroad car that's buried in to the side of the hill right now that is holding the track in place down in the Avalon area, for example, in the park. And so I don't know, were there other cars that were damaged or off the tracks or whatever?
That railroad car was a result of a train wreck. Had nothing to do with the flood.
The recent train wreck or another train wreck?
A long time ago. I mean, that probably happened in I'm guessing in the 60s. Yeah.
Question for you, Dr. Gus.
Yes.
Your 1868 reference to the flood, that was a time frame when essentially all our forests were denuded up through the Civil War, because that's what we used for power, steam, wood. It was interesting as you showed that that was a really devastating flood. What do you think after that more trees have been growing? We've actually...
Well, if you look at historical maps from around the Civil War period, to the extent that you can believe them, it does show not a stick of wood on large parts of the regional landscape. And we know that there's actually more forest throughout the Northeast now than there was back in the 19th century. So there's no question. And in fact, if you read the book and the description of that flood, first of all, it wasn't even a hurricane. It was basically a cloudburst thunderstorm. And probably, I don't know if any of you remember the August 1971 flood that hit over up to the northeast side of Baltimore. That also dropped something like 11 or 12 inches of rain. So it may have been something comparable to that. Maybe not a huge area, but I think there's so much sediment and probably so much debris moving that it probably made the flood worse than it might have been, because the erosion problems that were going on at that time were probably just stupendous. Yes?
As far as the sediment and the movement of masses in the water, I was on the viaduct, the Thomas Viaduct, the next morning, and it was interesting to see entire trees, 2 feet, 3 feet in diameter, coming down to the viaduct, entire trees.
Oh, it's unbelievable what you'll see moving in a big flood. I did not see Agnes, but I saw the flood on the, well, I wasn't there, but I have a video that was taken of the flood on the Rapidan River about halfway between DC and Charlottesville, and you can see whole, there's a scene where a tree, I mean a really big tree, actually stands up before it gets knocked over and goes under the bridge. And you see that anytime there's a really big flood and there's trees available. Just look along the Patapsco now, there are tree trunks everywhere just from Lee.
One last comment. While being on the bridge, the power stanchions were actually tumbled over. And I knew people along the road that when they went down during the night, the sky was illuminated. You know, this high voltage wires. So, but it was something that you see power stanchions down, you know, it was, that's all.
Okay, there was another one over here and then over there, yes.
My question was, how long was it before the railroad was functioning? You know?
I don't know how long before they put it back in service. It took them a year to remove the train. And there was, I think it was a while after that before they put it in service, because they did consider just abandoning the entire line. They didn't put signals back in until 1983, late 82, early 83. So it may have been a couple of years.
There's a question over here.
In 1956, Hurricane Hazel came through and caused quite a bit of damage. And after that, the state, under then Governor McKelvin, bought up an awful lot of that land in the Patapsco Valley for flood purposes. And south of Elk Ridge, the old Arundel Corporation lands were purchased also some of the areas you talked about earlier. They had cleanup, that was all Arundel Corporation areas that were bought up for flood control after that too. But it would have been a lot worse had that work not been done throughout the valley in the 50s and 60s.
It's also true that in the aftermath of Agnes, there are a lot of stream valleys throughout, certainly Baltimore County and Baltimore City, that they didn't rebuild properties, and those were allowed to grow up in parkland or forest land, and that's why there's less property at risk now in the floodplain than there was back then, because a conscious decision was made not to rebuild in all those places that were at risk, or at least some of them. Yes?
I'm curious as to the level of flooding, say, at Gun Road, Lost Lake area. Was the railroad track at the level that it is now, and did that flood?
I don't know the answer. Does anyone else?
I can answer that. I live on Gun Road. The water did not come up quite to the railroad tracks. It flooded what's now the History Center in the park. And Bob showed a factory that was there at the time, the smokestack, which is obvious. But again, it did not come up to the railroad tracks.
I'd like to add to that. Between Gun Road and Ilchester, along that major part of the state park through there were sections maybe 100 yards across that were just two ribbons of rails hanging in that area. I don't think, I used to get through those areas when I was a kid, through the backwoods. And I had a lot of photographs. I couldn't find them for this, but there were sections where there were just ribbons going across where it washed that bank out. Just,
Yes.
You mentioned that 1868 is sort of the genesis of memories of floods. In the 96 years since the Ellicott Brothers came, was there any evidence in the letters, diaries, folklore that there were other floods? Must have been.
Well, there was an 1866 flood that's also documented, but I don't think it was as big as the 1868. I haven't done historical archive research to be able to uncover other things, because this is not, the history of the Patapsco is actually not something I've investigated in that much depth. There may be, and certainly there's discussion of other floods in the chapter in the book that talks about flood history.
The flood of 1866 wiped out two arches of the Patterson's Viaduct, and they replaced them with the Bowman Truss Bridge, and then the flood of 1868 took that out too, wiped out the third arch. So 1866 must have been pretty bad too.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Outlined several other storms that put down considerable rainfall in the high teens. So why was Agnes at such a high level? There must be some other variables or conditions that got that, flood peak as high as it got.
It's really a combination of things. Number one, the maximum amount of rainfall might be in a small area, or it might be over a much larger area. So Agnes had a large area with more than 15 inches of rain, particularly in central Pennsylvania. That's why you had a huge flood on the Susquehanna. The storm was moving slowly enough that it had time. It also stayed over one area for long enough. So the rain just kept, the water just kept building and building and building. And if you have these narrow, steep valleys, that's where the force of the flood can be much greater, which is why you see the kind of devastation that you do. So I've studied some floods out in the Appalachians, particularly in West Virginia, where we have, again, these narrow, steep valleys and the devastation that you see. And we saw something like that in 1996 on the Rapidan River in the foothills of the Appalachians. You also see just incredible devastation, because it's a matter of how steep and narrow the valley is, and how much sediment and how much debris is coming down off the slopes. All those things play a role. You can get a very big flood in a fairly flat, open landscape, and there's a lot of damage, but it's mostly the landscape being underwater for a long time. You might get some sediment, but you don't necessarily have everything totally ripped up the way it is. So it's really a combination of the conditions that allow the storm to get locked in place and to keep dropping rain over the same place for a long period of time, and then the way the landscape processes that in order to make the water go at much higher velocities down the valley. Yes?
perspective on that, the 15 inches of rain represents a third of the entire average rainfall for the year. So you got that happening in 2 days versus 365 days.
The volume of rain that came down at that time was almost unbelievable. It was like a really big thunderstorm that went on for days. It just never stopped. Just a huge amount of water. Just kept hour after hour, day after day coming down. It was staggering.
Yeah, there are some historic floods that have dropped as much as between 27 and 36 inches of rain in less than 12 hours. That even dwarfs anything that happened in Agnes, but when that happens it's usually over a very small area. But those of you who are familiar with Hurricane Camille, which of course is famous for what it did on the Gulf Coast, then it came up and hit Nelson County in Virginia and caused just all the slopes let loose, and there were huge debris flows, and hundreds of people were killed in the middle of the night because there was so much rain that basically everything let loose. And there's a few floods that have happened like that have had that kind of intensity. That's about the most of the atmosphere can deliver. Agnes was slower and steadier over a longer period of time, and as intense as it was not as close to the absolute maximum the atmosphere can produce as some of these other ones that were more intense over maybe 8 to 12 hours, but over a smaller area. Yes? It depends on the temperature, it depends on a number of different kinds of conditions. So there's how much what we call precipitable moisture is in the atmosphere. You can't hold more than maybe 2 to 3, maybe 4 inches of water in the atmosphere at any one place. So how do you get that much rain? You basically have to have a situation where it's almost like a funnel. There's an air mass carrying large amounts of moisture. Here we're near the coast, so the moisture is coming in off the coast. The prevailing winds are driving it into a place where it can then rise, and it rises. If it keeps rising in the same place, it'll keep condensing, and it'll give you more and more rainfall. So it's when you get the kinds of conditions that give you those really high amounts are when we have what we call an upslope thunderstorm. It's basically a terrain-locked storm cell where the prevailing winds keep pushing against the same topographic obstacle. And we really have, it's what we call orographic precipitation. When you have a topographic barrier and the wind is blowing up against it and warm, moist air rises, it drops its rain right there. That's why the place in the world with the most annual rainfall measured is at a place called Cherrapunji in India. Why? The monsoon comes in off the water, heads inland and hits the foothills of the Himalayas. The air goes up and it drops. And Cherrapunji has had as much as 1,000 inches of rain in a year. And all during the rainy season. So. I don't recall whether it actually said. I don't know if there are actual measurements from that storm. We do have actual measurements from some of these more recent storms. There was one in north central Pennsylvania in 1942 that nobody's heard about. It's in a town called Smethport. That one dropped about 36 inches of rain in 12 hours. And the story is that people were afraid they were going to drown just standing outside, not because of flooding, but because there was literally no place it was impossible to breathe. The water was coming down so heavy. The Nelson County flood, 27 inches of rain in about 8 hours, also pretty close to that limit. So if you get that kind of rain, I've never seen that happen. In Rapidan River watershed in 1996, you got something comparable to that in a small area that dropped about that amount. It also caused debris flows that basically denuded the slopes as well, and then of course caused massive flooding, but in a smaller watershed. Yes?
I keep hearing about Hurricane Agnes, Tropical Storm Agnes. I've seen her identified as tropical cyclone. I grew up hearing about Hurricane Agnes. Part of my family's folklore that I was due before she arrived. I actually came after she arrived. So my mother had the agony of wondering whether I would be born during the storm. Hurricane Agnes was like a big deal. She is a tropical storm, it's a tropical cyclone, an extratropical cyclone. What exactly is the proper terminology?
So a hurricane is designated by the wind velocity. So if the maximum wind velocity is above 75 miles an hour, you can call it a hurricane. If it drops below that, you call it a tropical cyclone. So Agnes started as, I think might have been a category 1 hurricane, but by the time, when they go inland, they lose access to the source of moisture over the ocean and they tend to weaken. Agnes went off the coast of North Carolina, turned around and came back, so it picked up a little steam when it got out over the water, but it wasn't over its tropical location, so it never actually became a hurricane again, even though it got stronger. But Agnes, up in this area, was not important for how much wind it brought, it's because of how much rain it brought. And it was a tropical cyclone, but what happens is, a lot of hurricanes, most hurricanes, some of them will go right across Texas or Mexico, but a lot of them basically come out of the tropics and they turn and they head off to the north or northeast because they get caught up in the westerly winds and they get into the mid-latitudes, and then they're going to get mixed up with air masses in the mid-latitudes, and so they tend to lose a lot of their strength as a real tightly wound cyclone. But what then happens is they can get access to additional sources of moisture from these other frontal systems that they get combined with. So it's referred to as an extratropical transition. I'm not an atmospheric scientist. I have colleagues who write about this kind of thing. But the extratropical transition can be particularly dangerous when it gets up into the mid-latitudes because the remnants of the hurricane then pick up more moisture, slow down, and can drop it over a large area over an extended period of time. So Agnes was a hurricane before you arrived and a tropical cyclone after you arrived. Yes.
I was 7 years old when I moved here, and I came from Seattle, so rain to my family, we thought we were used to rain. And I remember when it started to rain, I was out playing in a little stream within Bonnie Ranch Road. And finally, on the second day, I think my parents decided when the water was, 10 feet above my head, maybe I should be playing out there. And I remember vividly the antique bottles that had washed from some of the antique stores on Main Street for weeks after the storm. You could find those in the sand down in the park.
We're still finding it.
Yeah.
And of course, for people who study floods, this is the golden age in the sense that everybody's got now a video camera on their phone. So now we have all kinds of documentary evidence we could never have before because people can document these things in real time. So we get more and more information because of that. Yes?
Well, I was in Pennsylvania last summer when whatever it was hit. It wasn't a hurricane, it wasn't terribly windy, but I'd never heard rain on the roof of my house like we had for days. And it was a disaster area, and still is. North central Pennsylvania, up in the mountains. And what happens is that the roads are fine, but there's so many streams, and they all back up with the Susquehanna. And then you get the flooding. And it's the small streams that flood. And it was a disaster. But I was going, just to comment, I was here during Agnes, and it is nothing but a miracle that had allowed the place to be cleaned up to the extent that it was for that big 200-year party. It was just incredible. Everybody was formal. There was a big dance at the country club, dinner dance, a well-known band, and just Meyer Davis. And it was just a beautiful affair, and everything looked beautiful, if you didn't look closely.
That just shows you the power of volunteers like all of you. Yes?
Elm City flood, Main Street, in my mind, but I want your opinion on it, is because of the Tiber. It can't get out into the Patapsco. Once the Patapsco gets high enough, the water just starts backing up.
Yeah, I think that is a factor. As she just described, it happens wherever there's a big river. If it backs up, then all the tributary valleys back up as well. Yes?
I wasn't here, I live in central Pennsylvania, so Agnes met it very good. People not here. I remember all the radio warnings to evacuate and finding the time. I haven't heard anyone talk about the flood coming. Did they have much notice? Was there much evacuation? You just looked out your window and it came as
So that's the difference between the Susquehanna Well, Schuylkill, I don't know where you were, well, the Schuylkill River itself is more comparable to the Tapsco in terms of size. It's a bit bigger. But whereas on the Susquehanna, it takes a number of days for the flood wave to get downstream. So, yeah, Wilkes-Barre and all the cities that are down along the Susquehanna, I mean, if you just watch what was going on along the Mississippi last year, these flood waves are rolling down the river, and I mean, there's a disaster, but it's a slow motion disaster.